Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about kind of the changing trends that I've seen over the last couple years and kind of how that relates to categorization of OA flaps. So we'll kind of start off with an overview and then we'll just kind of get into some of the other information I've compiled or in some examples. So first, I want to look at the definitions. These are what I would consider the Blue Book definitions. I think I pulled them from ISCA or OA Insignia. And they're, the whole point of having a collecting language is that it's consistent. I know that over the years, different books have categorized stuff slightly differently, or different lodges may categorize stuff slightly differently. But the whole point of having a collecting language is that it should be consistent, from resource to resource and, lodge to lodge. So this is kind of what I consider the Blue Book definition, which is kind of the standard. So for F, we have flap-shaped patches, not fully embroidered, regardless of material. Now, I think this goes back to maybe the last update. I'm not sure when they updated. I know they updated some of these not that terribly long ago, but the point is that they considered it an F if it was a material that did not already have a collecting letter. Okay, so like you have B for bullion, C for chenille, L for leather, and M for metal. And if it was made on those materials, even though it would fall under an F as being, probably as not being like it's not fully embroidered, but if it's on those materials, they were considered an exception. So it's like, okay, we'll list it as those, and then everything else not fully embroidered will be an F. There are some size restrictions. We're not going to really get into that. That's basically if you make a flap that's, 10 inches big or something, or 12 inches big, as like a back patch or a little keychain sized flap, that's really what the size restrictions are about, are excluding those from being listed as an F. And then you have S, which is solid embroidered patch. Basically the same exceptions and size restrictions as the F, but just if it's solid embroidered. And then you have W for wovens, and they were popular at one point, and you really don't see very many wovens anymore. I know 104 did some not too terribly long ago, so the lodges do occasionally still make them, but they are certainly less common than they were at one point. And finally, you have an additional prefix of lowercase e, which stands for event. Historically, you didn't have event lodge flaps, but that is something that has changed, and we'll get into that. But there are now event lodge flaps. So we'll kind of talk about that. The E prefix should stand for a lodge or chapter activity. You're not at a section or national event. So if you break this down, essentially you have a series of qualifiers that if you're going to identify a flap, you have to figure all this out about, if you're taking a patch, what shape is it? Okay, it's a flap shape. Good. We know it's something. Type of issue. Was it for a conclave or for a fellowship? That would identify if it's going to be an event patch. Material. What type of material is it made on? And then you have to know the embroidery percentage. So is it an F or an S? And then the chronological order. The result of that is you have at least 5 qualifiers that you're now looking at to identify one patch, to exactly what flap it is. So let's talk about why this can be maybe a little confusing to a new collector. This is my lodge, 296. And if you're thinking, okay, well, what's your first flap? Well, we have our first F, we have our first S, and then we have the first woven. And I put them here with the different dates. And if you have a collecting resource, usually the Fs are shown before the other ones. So, if you're just flipping through. So the F1 came out in 85. The S1, which is our actual first flap, came out in 1958. And the W1 came out in 75. So the confusion is just that they're not all chronologically in order under one letter. That's where the confusion comes in. And luckily, we don't have a lot. We only have one woven. We only have a handful of Fs. So basically, everything is an S, and it's all nice and neat in chronological order. There are lodges out there that have a significant number of Fs or other material flaps, and they're kind of interwoven. And if you're trying to do a display or something based on chronological order, they're all interwoven together, and it can kind of be hard to figure out where they quite all go. So these are the accepted material exceptions. So you have a bullion, and I kind of picked on 104 a little bit. Y'all know, we'll see a lot of their stuff just because they're easy to pull a lot of images from. They've made a lot of these different patches. So you have a bullion patch, the B5. You have a chenille, the C13. The leather, the L4. And the metal, the M1. So this just kind of gives you an example of a flap-shaped patch that isn't listed as an F or an S. It's not listed as a flap-shaped patch. It's instead listed based on the material it's made on. Okay? So material matters until they don't. There are a lot of materials besides these accepted exceptions. Now, on the left, you'll see these are all metals, but they're all different metals. And it's kind of interesting that, you know, you have the pewter ones, you have the bronze ones, you have the ones that look kind of like gold, you have the ones that are more, those were all made, I think, by one company, and then, they were some interesting guys. But then you have the one that's more like what you would order from Symbol Arts or one of those companies. And then you have different examples of, you know, like a felt patch. Well, a felt is not an exception that's accepted, you know, so it's listed as an F. It's listed at just like you would a twill flap. And then here you have a composite material. So this is felt, but it's backed on leather. So is this a F or is this an L? You know, if looking from the front, you would say that it would be an F because it's felt. But knowing that it's backed with leather, I guess it's an L. You see how this can get a little odd, a little confusing. And then here's some more materials. So here you have pleather. And my lesson of the day is don't confuse pleather with leather or you'll turn your F into an L. So that was a flap that Okenichi made, and they list their leather flaps as an L, but they listed their pleather flap as an F. And then you have some other, just a lot of different types of materials that people have made flaps on. You have the 272 sateen, you have the linen flap that was made and just embroidered on. You have this cork flap that was made, you know, it's from Black Eagle, and I don't have one, but they list the material as cork. And supposedly it was made from a sheet of material over in Europe, I guess. Kind of interesting. You have the F17 rubber flap, and then you have, you know, from 104, and then from 104 you have the F22 wood flap. And then you have this, which is the 3D printed flap from Jacobstown Lodge 21. And this is where, looking at these examples and this acrylic flap from Conwampus, I kind of want to talk about, at one time, I don't know, you know, I've been collecting relatively, I'm the young guy collecting, but I kind of got into the lodge in around 2007, 2008. I don't remember people just being able to easily make up flaps at their house. The reality of today is, with more and more people having 3D printers, with more and more people having these CNC machines in their garage, you're running into the issue of lodge members and lodges, you know, sometimes requesting them to do this or doing it on behalf of the lodge, making up small batches in these alternative materials. It is very easy, and you can order 3D printed flaps and stuff, but it's very easy to make these. We have a lodge member who, with the best of intentions, he made up a dozen wooden flaps in his he has a little CNC machine in his basement. He just cut them out of a nice hardwood and he brought them and donated them to the auction. He didn't mean anything by it, but you know, me as a collector sitting there trying to figure out how do you catalog it, well, it's essentially a private issue and it's an F. You know, it under the current categorization, it goes in as an F. And I think we're going to see more of that. Over the next 10 years, you're going to see a lot more because people can do it on demand. They can make up small batches. They can make something that to them is special. They can stick magnets on it and wear it on their uniform. You're going to see 3D printed items. You're going to see these wood cutout items. You're going to see these acrylic items. Just these odd things that we never would have thought of maybe in, back a ways as, oh, well, that's a patch. But they're wearing them as insignia for their lodge. And so it's kind of a little shift that's going on, I think, and, Okanichi made that rubber flap, I don't know, it was 2013 or so, maybe 10 years ago. And at that time, I think I'd only ever seen one other one. Since then, I've seen a lot. And so the thing that has happened is these alternative, and I just kind of mean alternative materials, all these kind of non-traditional materials are becoming much more common. And it's kind of becoming a thing of they don't really care what they're made out of. I mean, people used to say, well, if you can't wear it on your uniform, it's not a real flap or something like that. Well, you stick some magnets on it and you can wear it on your uniform, and people are doing that. I remember seeing these acrylic flaps at NOAC. There was a guy from Michigan, and he's wearing them there. As the hobby has changed, as things have changed, I think we need to just kind of think about it a little bit as to whether any of the collecting terminology needs to adapt to this. I think that you're going to see a lot more of this going forward. I would strongly suspect that there will be 3D printed flaps at NOAC this year. Here are some more examples, and some of these are a little questionable. You have an F6, the beaded flap, and this is one that's considered an official lodge issue. You, of course, have ones that are not considered official lodge issues that somebody just privately made up. You have the decal with the marrowed edge. Well, that's weird, but Nawakwa, I don't know if all y'all know, but Nawakwa owns a marrowing machine. The lodge has one. So when they want to change the marrowed edge on a patch, they change it themselves. And so they just order decals and marrowed them themselves. The 308 metal flap that I'd always thought, that's a metal flap. I never realized I've seen them. I just never realized that it's actually a decal put on a metal blank. I never realized that was actually a decal on metal. And apparently there are loose decals that were not, they had extras. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, I do think, there is a minimum requirement to what you list things as. I've seen two of these. This one's from Lodge 101, and I'm sorry it's not a better picture. But it is the chocolate flap from Mikanakwa 101. So I guess the question of the day on some of this is, where is the line? And then, is that it back there? Here's some more interesting stuff. And this is, I know that some people, sometimes you sit there and you go, seriously, am I expected to collect this and put, serious collectible value on something? And I understand that, but at the same time, that's kind of the point of this is it's like, well, yeah, the material matters. And then, because see, you have here a Tulo 161, you have their leather flap. Now the story behind this is they showed up for the powwow, the conclave, essentially, and they didn't have a flap yet. They'd just done the merger. And so what they did is they took these leather flaps, and you can actually see right to the right of the 161 is one, and the other one's a little farther down to the left of the T, are staple holes. They made up these flaps on leather, and they stapled them on the boys' uniforms that were there for the event. Okay, that's all it is. They made up they said, oh yeah, we're gonna have 40 people or how many ever it is. And they made up these and they stapled them on for the event. The 191, that paper is like I think it's a laminated paper, but it's been described to me as vinyl, but I think it's like a laminated paper. That 191 flap is the first flap that lodge had. They issued them to their members. I think they were going to NOAC, and the flaps hadn't arrived yet. And so they did essentially the same thing as the 161 guys. And I know that there's been more than one lodge that has done something similar over the years. So I know John Hoffman, I can't remember who he gave it to, but he had a flap where he went with a contingent, and this is back probably, it's probably back in like the early 90s or something, kind of when he first got back in collecting. But he went with a lodge contingent, and they didn't have a flap yet, and so they all got one. It was essentially a laminated flap of the design that they had ordered with a big pin on the back, and they wore that on their uniforms. And I think issues like that have been ignored, but I guess my question is, okay, so if they had done the exact same thing but made it out of leather, then does that mean it's collectible? But if they laminate it, it's not collectible? It's something to think about. The 343s are interesting. They listed both of these as Fs. And there's only difference between these, really, they're all hand painted, is that they hand painted a number of them on paper, and those were given to the regular members, and then they hand painted ones on leather, and they were given to the officers. And those were used as the first flap until they got a patch. And so, it's on paper. I guess at some point you have to decide if you want to collect it. I know if it was my area, I would certainly want it. Does this mean that, if you were looking to pay, the 161 flap, I think, is about a $2,000 flap. So would I feel comfortable buying one without some good provenance that it was authentic? I would probably want that, to pay that kind of money for something that I could essentially make. But I don't think that, the value of it aside, if my lodge did anything like this, I would want to collect it. So we've kind of talked about materials. I want to touch on event flaps. And I try not to be too, we all have our own opinions about all this. I'm of the opinion, and I'll tell you, I don't think there should be an event flap. I think that they should all either be an S or an F, under the current categorization. I just don't like moving flap patches under lodge events. I just don't like it. I understand the good argument for it is that it is a lodge function patch, and they are not having to represent themselves to the section, or they're not having to represent their lodge members, outside of their lodge, kind of thing. The Traderie one from Okanichi, I'm not as sure on, because really, if in theory, they're representing themselves to all the people coming in for the Traderie, so I'm not sure if that really holds there. But for like a fall fellowship patch, in theory, it's they're all their own lodge members are going to be there. It shouldn't, they're not wearing it to represent the lodge. They're not listing it as a flap in the traditional sense. My lodge doesn't make these. I'm really glad we don't. But I have a feeling you're going to see a lot more of these in the coming years. And if you just look at the picture, you see this is 117. They had their S1 come out in 1967. They didn't have a flap that wasn't like a standard issue flap until 1988. So, pretty good long while. But ever since 1988, they've been making Conclave. They've been making NOAC patches. They've been making all these other patches. Well, in the last couple years, they've started making these fall fellowship flaps. And 10 years ago, I'm not sure I could have told you anybody, any lodge that made a fall fellowship or spring fellowship, a fellowship lodge flap. But now I could easily name off half a dozen, because more lodges are doing it. People know that people like to collect flaps, and for whatever reason, lodges have gotten to where they want to make these, and they are making them. So you're going to have to catalog them as they come out, and you're going to see a lot more of them. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind as we go forward. So I've given you some information. What does this really mean? I think that there is a need to simplify the qualifiers for identifying lodge flaps. So if we look at the qualifiers that we went over earlier, you have the shape. Well, okay, it's a flap shaped patch. Not that hard. Fine. The type of issue, if it's for a conclave or for a fellowship, personally, I would lean to, if it's a flap shaped patch, just list it as a flap. What you want to do when you are designing a system to categorize collectibles, you want it to be as simple as it can be. Because that way the most amount of people can understand it and utilize it. It needs to be simple. If it's a flap shaped patch, in my opinion, it should be just listed as a flap shaped patch. Don't make it more complicated by putting some of the flaps somewhere else. I think that we at least need to look at getting rid of the material requirement for flaps. It doesn't make any sense to me that if I make a flap out of metal, it's not listed as an F, but if I make it out of wood, it is an F. It doesn't make any sense to me that I can 3D print one and that is an F, but if I call up a company and have a chenille made, well, we're going to call that a C. It just, basing a qualifier on material but then excluding other materials is not consistent. And so I think it'd be a lot easier to just put them all together, at least under an F and S. Personally, I would lean towards combining all flap shaped patches and just put them in chronological order. So you have the first one up to the current one. If you think about it, the reason why we have F and S goes back to the old collecting guides and the old mail trading. When they were trying to describe the different patches, they were saying, okay, well, we're going to label this as an F because that means it has no twill and people will understand that. And we're going to label this as an S. That means we're going to label this as a W because people need to know this is a woven. Fine. No one collects doing mail trades like that, where they're not, people have phones, they have the internet, they see pictures. And all the collecting guides now are pictorial. If you go onto OA Insignia, which is the old OA Images site, if you go on Patch Vault, what you start off looking at is the pictures. There really is no real need to break flaps into multiple different subcategories of flap-shaped patches. So if we could get rid of material and embroidery percentage as a qualifier, we'd be down to essentially event versus not event, the shape in chronological order. It'd make it very easy. I know some people are really adamant that it needs to stay separated on the event basis, but I guess I'll take what I can get. But I really don't see the reason of why we break some stuff out based on material instead of just going by the shape. So that's really all I have there. It's just I'm hoping that maybe it brought some attention to how the hobby has changed. And 10 years ago, I would have never thought I would have seen a 3D printed flap, or I would never have thought I'd seen the prevalence of wooden flaps and metal flaps and all these other things that I just see so many of now, and every year there's more of them.